ready to rethink American history. We're going deep on A People's History of the United States.
A book that, it flips the script on how we usually think about America.
Exactly. It reveals all those hidden stories and struggles that really shaped this nation.
Like, we're talking about the people the textbooks leave out, the everyday folks, the rebels, the dissenters.
Yeah, it's history from the ground up. And there are some seriously eye-opening moments in this book, trust me.
Stuff that might make you question everything you learned in school.
For sure. So buckle up. We're going to uncover some fascinating and, at times, shocking truths about the American past.
We're going to jump right in.
Let's start with King Philip's War in 1676.
Yeah. A brutal conflict that really decimated Native American populations.
And Zinn argues that it wasn't some, inevitable clash of cultures.
He points out that the English elite, they instigated this war for their own gain.
Economic and political gain.
Right. Ordinary Englishmen didn't really want to fight, but the consequences for Native Americans. Devastating thousands died in the fighting, and the war set the stage for centuries of displacement and dispossession.
Wow, it's a stark reminder that the conquest of America wasn't just about military might.
No, it wasn't. It was about manipulation.
Exploitation.
Exactly. And the impact of European diseases on Native populations.
Oh, yeah. That's a chilling example.
Zinn highlights how disease, often unintentionally spread, played a massive role in decimating Native communities.
Like on Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah. The population plummeted from around 3,000 to just over 300 in a little over a century.
Wow.
And Block Island, a similar tragedy.
So bad.
Dropping from about 1,500 to 51. Just 51.
Imagine that loss. It's unbelievable.
It really puts into perspective the devastating impact of colonization.
Beyond the battlefield, for sure. And it kind of sets the stage for Zinn's central theme, the role of power dynamics in shaping the American narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of power dynamics,
we can't ignore the slave trade.
Right. Zinn does not shy away from describing the brutal conditions on those slave ships.
Suffocating holds disease death, just awful.
People were so desperate they jumped overboard to escape the suffering.
It's unimaginable. But it's crucial to understand this wasn't just about individual cruelty.
It was a system.
Exactly, a system designed to exploit and profit from enslaved Africans.
And Zinn challenges that idea that slavery was just due to natural racial repugnance.
Right. He says it was about the demand for labor in the colonies.
Especially on the plantations.
They needed workers.
Yeah.
And there just weren't enough white laborers.
Indentured or otherwise.
Exactly, to meet that demand.
He makes this point with an example from Virginia.
Okay, tell me about it.
In 1700, there were about 6,000 slaves in the colony.
Okay.
By 1763, that number had skyrocketed to 170,000.
Wow, that's almost half the population.
It's crazy. Clearly, economic forces were at play here, not just prejudice.
And to maintain this system, slave owners used psychological and physical control.
Like breaking up families.
Yes, instilling fear, using violence to crush any resistance.
Zinn even quotes a slave owner who said enslaved Africans weren't natural-born slaves.
They had to be forced into submission.
It's a chilling reminder of the calculated brutality of that system.
And it leads us to another pivotal event, Bacon's Rebellion in 1676.
A full-blown uprising against the elite.
It shows how class conflict has always been simmering beneath the surface of American society.
Think about it. This wasn't just a few disgruntled colonists.
No, it was white frontiersmen, black slaves, indentured servants, all united.
All angry at the ruling class.
Fed up with exploitation, fed up with being marginalized, and that constant threat of violence from Native Americans, which the elite just didn't seem to care about.
Zinn quotes a Royal Commission's description of Nathaniel Bacon, the leader of the rebellion.
What did they say?
They said he inflamed those people with talk of dissatisfaction and rebellion.
He knew how to tap into that resentment.
He was a charismatic figure, for sure, and this rebellion.
It symbolizes the persistent class struggle that Zinn traces throughout American history.
On constant battle between the powerful and the powerless.
Exactly. And to understand the struggle, we need to look at indentured servants in colonial America.
Right. Now, some indentured servants did improve their lives.
But many remained trapped.
Trapped in a system that benefited the wealthy elite.
It wasn't a guaranteed path to a better life.
Like some people might imagine.
It was a gamble with the odds stacked against them.
Imagine arriving in this new land, hoping for a better future, only to find yourself stuck in a harsh labor contract.
With little control over your own destiny.
Zinn doesn't just tell us about this. He shows us.
How?
He uses primary sources, like a 1737 letter to the New York Journal.
Okay, what does it say?
It describes a young street urchin forced to beg for scraps.
Wow. That's a powerful image of poverty and inequality.
That existed even in the so-called land of opportunity.
And the wealthy elite, they weren't oblivious to this suffering.
Zinn argues they were afraid.
Afraid of what?
Of a potential alliance between poor whites and blacks.
A classic divide-and-conquer strategy.
But it worked.
It led to the strict enforcement of racial divisions.
With laws against interracial marriage. Just one example.
A way to maintain control by exploiting racial tensions.
Rather than addressing the economic inequalities.
Which threaten their dominance.
It's a tactic we see throughout history, isn't it?
It is.
And perhaps one of the most surprising revelations in a people's history.
Let's hear it.
Is Zinn's take on the American Revolution. He says it wasn't just about taxes.
Of course, no taxation without representation was a rallying cry. But there was something deeper going on.
A desire for a more inclusive and democratic system.
Brewing beneath the surface.
Exactly. Zinn points to the demands of mechanics in colonial cities.
They wanted more than just lower taxes.
Right. They called for open legislative meetings, equitable taxes.
They wanted a say in how they were governed.
They felt excluded from the political process.
And they demanded a seat at the table.
It's like they were saying, we're not just going to be cogs in the machine. We want a voice.
They wanted to shape their own destinies.
And this desire for a more just system.
It wasn't limited to the cities.
Zinn highlights the tenant uprisings and rebellions happening in rural areas.
Against wealthy landowners.
These weren't isolated incidents.
They were organized social movements.
Challenging the power structure.
Demanding a fairer share of the land.
So we see this discontent, this yearning for a more equitable society, coming from both urban and rural areas.
And then comes the Constitution.
The document that's often hailed as a masterpiece of democracy.
A masterpiece.
But Zinn offers a different perspective.
Of course he does.
He draws upon Charles Beard's analysis of the Constitution.
Which argues
that its framers, primarily wealthy landowners and merchants,
designed a system that served their own interests.
It wasn't about creating a truly equitable society,
but solidifying the power of the elite.
It's important to remember who was left out.
Who?
Slaves, indentured servants, women, men without property.
They had no say in this foundational document.
The Constitution, while groundbreaking in many ways,
it also reflected the limitations and inequalities of its time.
And these limitations fuel the continued unrest.
And led to the rise of those social movements in the 19th century.
That's a great point. Zinn goes on to explore the growth of labor movements and strikes,
highlighting those brutal working conditions,
especially in the textile mills,
which drove workers to organize.
And he brings this struggle to life with the example of the 1834 Lowell strike.
Tell me more about that.
It was young women working in grueling conditions, demanding better treatment.
They took a stand.
Zinn even describes one woman delivering what a newspaper called a flaming Mary Wollstonecraft speech.
On the rights of women.
And the iniquities of the moneyed aristocracy.
Wow, that must have been something.
She inspired her fellow workers to fight for their rights.
It's incredible to see those individuals finding their voice, standing up to exploitation.
On this desire for equality. It wasn't just in the workplace. It was around this time that the women's rights movement started gaining traction.
Absolutely. Zinn shares Sarah Grimke's response to attempts to silence women in religious settings.
Her words are powerful. I ask no favors for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet off our necks.
It's a declaration of independence.
And it speaks to the growing awareness of women's rights.
And their determination to break free.
And this awareness of injustice. It extended to class issues as well. Zinn points to the rise of class consciousness during the Jacksonian era.
Okay. Tell me more.
Edward Pessin, a historian Zinn cites, described Jacksonian labor leaders as radicals.
Radicals.
Who saw American society as deeply divided by class conflict.
Interesting. So it wasn't just an abstract theory.
Not at all. It was reflected in real-world events, like the 1837 flour riot in New York City.
People taking to the streets over the high cost of food.
Desperate times. And then there was the formation of the Equal Rights Party.
A direct challenge to the establishment.
People were waking up to the fact that the system wasn't working for everyone.
Setting the stage for one of the most pivotal moments in U.S. history.
The Civil War.
A fight to end slavery.
But Zinn argues that the motivations were more complex.
More complex? How so?
He doesn't deny the moral imperative of abolishing slavery.
Right.
But he also points to the economic and political factors that contributed to the conflict.
So it wasn't just about ending slavery.
It was a confluence of factors that ultimately led to war.
I see. And as the war raged on.
It became a turning point in the fight against slavery.
But Zinn is careful to point out the mixed experiences of Black people during and after the war,
He contrasts the optimism of Frederick Douglass
who saw emancipation as a beacon of hope,
with the more sobering perspective of Thomas Hall.
who felt that freedom without opportunity was meaningless.
It's a reminder that the struggle for true equality can be a long and arduous journey.
And Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War that promised so much for Black Americans, it fell short.
Zinn argues that despite some progress, Reconstruction was undermined by compromises.
Compromises between.
Northern and Southern elites.
Oh, wow. That's a betrayal.
It led to the disenfranchisement of Black voters and the rise of Jim Crow.
A system of segregation and oppression.
That would cast a long shadow over American society.
A tragic example of how, even in moments of progress, the forces of power can find ways to maintain their dominance.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight for justice is rarely straightforward.
And victories can be fragile.
And this brings us to the Gilded Age, an era of immense wealth and industrial expansion.
But also stark inequality.
Zinn focuses on the rise of the robber barons.
Those titans of industry who amassed fortunes while exploiting workers.
And names names too. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie's Steel Empire.
Monopolies that came to dominate the economic landscape.
And as these industrial giants were amassing their fortunes, a new wave of labor movements emerged.
Challenging their power.
Groups like the Knights of Labor.
And the industrial workers of the world, the IWW.
They advocated for workers' rights.
Challenging the foundations of the capitalist system.
They understood that the benefits of industrialization weren't being shared equally.
And that concentration of wealth in the hands of a few was detrimental to the many.
A theme that resonates even today.
As we grapple with income inequality, corporate power, the erosion of workers' rights.
This brings us to the 20th century, an era of wars, economic upheaval, and a wave of social movements that would reshape the American landscape.
Zinn doesn't hold back in describing America's entry into World War I.
And the government's suppression of dissent.
Through the Espionage Act.
A stark reminder that even in times of war, those in power often prioritize their agendas over individual liberties.
A sobering thought.
And the suppression of dissenting voices.
It didn't end with the war.
The Red Scare that followed World War I saw widespread persecution.
Of radicals, labor organizers, anyone deemed a threat.
Fear and paranoia expertly manipulated to justify the curtailment of civil liberties.
And the silencing of opposition.
A pattern we see repeated throughout history.
Often in times of crisis.
And then came the Great Depression,
which shook the foundations of American society.
Zinn captures the widespread poverty and desperation of those years.
But he also examines the government's attempts to stabilize the economy.
Through the New Deal.
It's important to remember that the New Deal, while groundbreaking,
was also a product of political compromises.
It aimed to preserve the existing capitalist system.
Even as it offered relief to the most vulnerable.
Makes sense.
Zinn also delves into the rise of the civil rights movement.
Focusing on the struggles in the South.
The courageous work of organizations like SNCC.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
And the growing militancy of activists like Malcolm X.
He doesn't shy away from the violence and brutality that the movement faced.
Nor does he gloss over the internal debates and disagreements.
It's a reminder that even within movements for social justice, there's often a diversity of tactics and ideologies.
And then we come to the Vietnam War.
A conflict that deeply divided the nation.
And sparked a massive anti-war movement.
Zinn highlights the diverse groups that participated in this movement.
Students, veterans, religious leaders, everyday citizens.
He also explores the government's efforts to control public opinion and discredit the opposition.
The Vietnam War really exposed the contradictions of American foreign policy.
The gap between rhetoric and reality.
And Zinn's account forces us to confront the human cost of that war.
For both the Vietnamese people and the American soldiers.
Zinn also examines the rise of the women's liberation movement,
highlighting the work of figures like Betty Friedan and Adrienne Rich.
He explores how the movement challenged traditional gender roles, demanded equal rights, and ultimately reshaped American society.
What's striking is how Zinn connects these various social movements, showing how they intersected and influenced one another.
It's not just a collection of isolated stories, but a tapestry that reveals the interconnectedness of these struggles.
For justice and equality.
And yet, Despite the progress made by these movements, Zinn argues that class and racial inequality persisted in the late 20th century,
He points to the urban uprisings of the 1960s.
and the growing disillusionment with the political system.
The gains made by these movements were often met with resistance and backlash.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight for a more just and equitable society is never truly finished.
And that brings us to the final decades of the 20th century and beyond.
Zinn explores the continued U.S. intervention in foreign conflicts
Using examples like the Iran-Contra affair,
and the Gulf War,
he questions the motives behind these interventions,
suggesting that they often serve corporate interests and geopolitical agendas.
rather than genuine humanitarian concerns.
A critical perspective that challenges the dominant narrative
Of American exceptionalism.
and forces us to critically examine the role of the U.S. in the global landscape.
For sure. And it's not like dissent just disappeared.
Zinn highlights the emergence of new social movements, the environmental movement, the anti-nuclear movement, and the fight for LGBTQ+ rights.
He sees these movements as a continuation of that long tradition of resistance and activism that's been a constant thread throughout American history.
Exactly. And that's what makes a people's history so compelling.
It reminds us that history is not a fixed narrative.
But a living, breathing dialogue.
It's a struggle over whose voices are heard, whose stories are told, and whose perspectives shape our understanding of the past.
And by uncovering those hidden histories,
By amplifying the voices of those who've been marginalized and silenced.
we can gain a more nuanced and complete understanding of the forces that have shaped our world.
Absolutely. It's not about accepting the story you've been given. It's about questioning everything, digging deeper, forming your own conclusions.
And that's what makes this book so powerful. It's not just about learning facts. It's about developing a critical lens through which to view history and the world around us.
It encourages us to think for ourselves, to challenge the status quo, to recognize the power of collective action.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Shoot.
What stood out to you as the most surprising or thought-provoking revelation from a people's history?
That's tough. There's so much. But for me, it was how Zinn connected those early struggles for equality to the labor movements that emerged during the Gilded Age. He really highlighted how, despite all that progress and wealth, the gap between the rich and poor just kept widening.
It's almost like a recurring theme throughout American history, this tension between progress and inequality.
Absolutely. And Zinn really dives into the lives of those ordinary workers during the Gilded Age, especially those working in factories and sweatshops. The conditions they faced were just brutal. Long hours, low wages, dangerous workplaces. It was a different time.
He doesn't just present those as like abstract statistics, though, right?
No way. He uses personal stories and firsthand accounts to bring the human cost of that exploitation to life. For example, he talks about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City.
Oh yeah, in 1911.
Over 140 garment workers died, mostly young immigrant women.
Because of unsafe working conditions.
It was a tragedy that really shook the nation and pushed the labor movement forward, but it also showed how callous those in power were, putting profits over people's safety and well-being.
Profits over people. It's a stark reminder that progress often comes at a price.
And that the benefits of economic growth aren't always shared equally.
And speaking of benefits not being shared equally,
Zinn's account of America's entry into World War I is fascinating.
he argues that U.S. involvement wasn't just about making the world safe for democracy.
Like we're often told.
Powerful economic and political interests were at play.
And those interests often outweighed the concerns of ordinary people sent off to fight and die.
He also discusses the government's suppression of dissent during the war.
Like with?
The Espionage Act.
Oh, right, which was used to.
Silence anyone who criticized the war effort or questioned the motives of those in power.
Troubling for sure, even in times of national crisis. When we're supposed to be unified, the voices of dissent can be silenced.
And it's not just wartime censorship.
No, Zinn points out how fear and paranoia
Can be used by those in power.
to maintain control.
He gives the example of the Red Scare after World War I,
Oh, yeah. That widespread fear of communist and socialist influence.
which was used to justify persecuting labor activists, immigrants, anyone seen as a threat.
A reminder that history often repeats itself. We need to be careful and protect our civil liberties, especially when faced with narratives that promote fear and division.
Absolutely. And speaking of fear and division,
Few events in American history were as devastating as the Great Depression.
Zinn really captures the suffering and desperation. Millions lost their jobs, their homes, their sense of security.
A national crisis that exposed the flaws in the economic system.
Zinn explores the responses to the Depression, the government's attempts to stabilize the economy through the New Deal, the rise of those radical movements calling for more fundamental changes.
It reminds us of the importance of social safety nets and government intervention in times of crisis.
For sure. And amidst all this economic turmoil, the seeds of a movement for racial justice were being sown.
Zinn talks about the rise of the civil rights movement,
Focusing on those struggles in the South,
where Black Americans faced segregation, disenfranchisement, violence.
he highlights the courage and resilience of those who fought for equality.
From the organizers of the Montgomery bus boycott
To the Freedom Riders,
he also discusses the role of organizations like SNCC,
the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
which mobilized young people and challenged the status quo.
And Zinn doesn't shy away from the complexities of the movement.
The internal debates over strategy and tactics.
For example, he contrasts the nonviolent resistance of Martin Luther King Jr.
With the more militant approach of Malcolm X.
It's a reminder that social movements are rarely simple.
There are diverse viewpoints and approaches.
Zinn's account allows us to see the civil rights movement as a complex and evolving struggle.
With fascinating characters, internal tensions, moments of both triumph and tragedy.
And as the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, the U.S. found itself in another conflict, the Vietnam War.
A war that deeply divided the nation.
Zinn's account of the Vietnam War is really insightful. He doesn't just focus on the military and political aspects,
He delves into the anti-war movement.
showing how it was fueled by a diverse coalition of groups: students, veterans, religious leaders, everyday citizens.
And it wasn't just about protesting the war itself.
Right. It was about questioning American foreign policy, challenging that Cold War ideology.
Which led to such a devastating conflict.
Zinn highlights the government's efforts to discredit the anti-war movement, using propaganda surveillance
Even violence.
to silence dissent.
A reminder that even in a democracy, the powerful often use questionable tactics.
To stay in power.
And while the Vietnam War raged on, another movement was gaining momentum.
The women's liberation movement.
Zinn explores the roots of this movement, tracing it back to those early feminist pioneers,
Who fought for suffrage.
and challenged those traditional gender roles,
He discusses the impact of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique.
which exposed the dissatisfaction of women with their limited roles,
And he highlights the work of activists like Adrienne Rich.
who challenged patriarchal norms and advocated for women's autonomy.
It was a movement that transformed American society, challenged gender stereotypes, demanded equal rights.
Paving the way for future generations.
And it's fascinating how Zinn connects these various social movements, showing how they intersected and influenced one another.
It's a tapestry that reveals the interconnectedness of these struggles for justice and equality.
And yet, despite all this progress, Zinn reminds us that the fight for a more just and equitable society isn't over. He points to the persistence of class and racial inequality in the late 20th century,
Events like the urban uprisings of the 1960s.
fueled by anger over poverty, discrimination, police brutality.
He suggests that progress is often met with resistance co-optation, even backlash.
It's a sobering reminder that progress is rarely linear, and hard-won victories can be fragile.
And that brings us to those final decades of the 20th century and into the 21st.
Zinn explores the continued U.S. intervention in foreign conflicts, the Iran-Contra affair,
The Reagan administration secretly selling arms to Iran,
to fund the Contras.
a right-wing rebel group in Nicaragua,
He also discusses the Gulf War.
which many saw as a way for the U.S. to assert its dominance in the Middle East.
Zinn's account challenges how these conflicts were often presented, questioning the motives, highlighting the human cost.
And even as the U.S. was projecting its military power abroad,
New social movements were emerging at home.
continuing that long tradition of resistance,
Zinn highlights the environmental movement.
which gained traction in the 1970s.
As people became aware of the threats posed by pollution, deforestation, climate change,
He also discusses the anti-nuclear movement
responding to the dangers of nuclear weapons.
and the nuclear arms race.
He explores the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, a movement that gained momentum in the late 20th century.
And continues to fight for equality today.
Zinn sees these movements as evidence that the struggle for justice is ongoing. Each generation faces its own challenges, and the fight for a more just and equitable world is never truly finished. His work reminds us that history is not just a collection of facts and dates, but a living narrative that we are all part of shaping.
It's a call to action, an invitation to examine the stories we tell ourselves about the past, and to consider how those stories shape our present and our future.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
And that even small acts of resistance can contribute to a larger movement for change.
It's amazing how Zinn manages to connect all these threads of history, showing how these struggles for justice and equality aren't just isolated incidents.
But part of a larger ongoing narrative.
It makes you realize that history is not just some dry textbook subject, but a living, breathing story that's still unfolding around us.
In a people's history, it really challenges us to rethink those dominant narratives we've been taught to just accept.
Like whose voices get amplified and whose get silenced.
Exactly. Zinn forces us to ask those tough questions, to look beyond the traditional heroes and villains, to recognize how ordinary people shape the course of events.
It's almost like he's giving us permission to question everything, to be skeptical of those narratives that have been presented to us as the absolute truth.
It can be incredibly empowering.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this book so relevant, even today. It encourages us to think critically about the information we're bombarded with, to challenge the status quo, and to consider alternative perspectives.
It's about being an active participant in how we understand history.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into a people's history, I'm curious.
What are you curious about?
What resonated most with you? What surprised you? What made you think differently about American history?
That's a great question, I think, for me. It was how Zinn revealed those hidden stories of resistance, whether it was enslaved people rebelling, workers organizing, everyday citizens taking to the streets to demand change. There's this constant thread of people fighting for a more just world. It's inspiring,
Yeah, it is. And it reminds us that we all have a role to play in shaping a better future.
We do.
I think what struck me the most was Zinn's emphasis on the power of collective action. Throughout history, ordinary people have come together to challenge injustice and demand change. And even when those movements face setbacks or defeats, the very act of resistance planted seeds for future progress.
It shows us that change is possible, even when things seem impossible.
Exactly. So Zinn's work reminds us that history is not just something we read about in textbooks. It's a living, breathing narrative that we are all part of shaping. It's about understanding the struggles of those who came before us, learning from their triumphs and their mistakes, and using that knowledge to build a more just and equitable world for ourselves and for future generations.
Beautifully said. And if you're ready to explore this alternative view of American history, to uncover those hidden stories and challenge your own assumptions, then you need to pick up A People's History of the United States.
You can find a link to purchase the book in our show notes.
And remember, your purchase helps support the show and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into fascinating and thought-provoking topics.
So until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make history.
Zinn's work is all about reminding us that history, it's not just a set narrative,
It's a living, breathing dialogue.
Right.
Whose voices get heard, whose stories are told, and how does that shape our understanding of the past?
Exactly. By digging into those hidden histories, highlighting the voices that have been marginalized,
We can gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of the forces that shape the world we live in.
Absolutely. And it's not about just accepting the story you've been given. It's about questioning, digging deeper, forming your own conclusions based on the evidence.
And that's what makes A People's History such a powerful book. It's not just about learning facts and figures.
No, it's about developing a critical lens to view history and the world around us in a whole new way.
It's about thinking for ourselves, challenging the status quo, recognizing that collective action has the power to make a real difference.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive on A People's History, I'm curious, what stood out to you as the most surprising or thought-provoking revelation from A People's History? Was there a particular event, a quote, a perspective that really shifted your understanding of the American past?
Honestly, there are so many. But one thing that really struck me was Zinn's emphasis on the power of collective action. He shows how throughout history, ordinary people have come together to challenge injustice and demand change. And even when those movements faced setbacks, the very act of resistance planted the seeds for future progress.
It's powerful stuff.
It reminds us that change is possible, even when it feels impossible.
That's a great takeaway. And for our listeners out there, I think the most important thing to remember is that history is not just something we read about in textbooks. It's alive. It's unfolding all around us. And we are all a part of shaping it.
We are all participants in this ongoing narrative, and Our choices, our actions shape the course of Calgary. It's both exciting and a little daunting, don't you think?
I agree. It's both a responsibility and an opportunity. So if you're ready to dive deeper into this alternative view of American history, to uncover those hidden stories and challenge your own assumptions,
I highly recommend picking up a copy of A People's History of the United States. You can find a link to buy the book in our show notes.
And remember, your purchase helps support the show and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into fascinating and thought-provoking topics.
So until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make history.